Well, welcome. I am so glad you have joined us here today. And I know you can't wait to hear today's episode. But just before we dive in, I wanted to share some ways that we can work together if you happen to be looking to uplevel your negotiation skills to negotiate a better life. I've got everything from online to my group to my signature VIP or mastermind experiences to help you get more of what you want and deserve in life. If that sounds interesting to you, check it out at artoffemininenegotiation.com. And now, the reason you are here on to today's program, I'm very happy to introduce you to Dr. Erika Rasure. Welcome, Erika. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
And today we're going to be talking about negotiating with your inner critic to break the debt cycle. And for those of you who may not know her, Dr. Erika is a former financial advisor and university professor turned financial therapist, which I just love that term, and educator. She's helped thousands of people approach their money in a more holistic, positive way. And we could certainly all use that. I know I could. If you're like me, it's finances always carry a certain amount of stress with them. So today you are going to uncover the secret to how to get rid of all of that stress and start managing your finances in a more holistic way. And she's currently serving as the Chief Financial Wellness Advisor at Beyond Finance. And we get a pad and pen if you don't have one ready, because you're going to be getting lots of golden gems here today. So I guess first, Erika, how did you come to this line of work?
Well, it's a long story, but I think we all have a long story. But the short version is when I first went to college, I had the intention of becoming an estate planning attorney. And the reason that was is I lost my dad at a really young age. I was 13 and he passed away from multiple sclerosis. And so I had at a very early age kind of this awareness around money and how important it was to plan for end of life.
Yeah.
And, growing up with a parent who had a chronic illness, and both my parents happened to be insurance agents as well. And so I had this really early exposure to things like guaranteed insurability and all of this. And, I know weird things for a 13-year-old, but, you
Yeah.
know, I really did. I was like, okay, I want to help people, plan for end of life financially. I did the pre-law thing, and about my senior year of high school or college, I was just like, I don't think I want to do this. This sounds absolutely boring to me.
I don't blame you.
Yeah. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to go ahead and look for something else. And I said, I still want to help people with, the financial aspect of this, but is there something different? And I happened to
Yeah.
come across the graduate program at the University of Missouri, go Mizzou. And that's where I ended up. And I started down that path, also as a financial advisor and insurance agent kind of simultaneously. And over the years, financial counseling and coaching and therapy, especially as I got into my PhD program, that really became my area of interest. And so I shifted really from the more, technical, math equation part of financial planning to really help people uncover the emotional underpinnings of what it is they're going through, financially. Because especially as I
Yeah.
think about women, internal negotiation is the one most women skip when it comes to their money, and in particular with your debt. The moment you realize your debt isn't just a math problem, it's actually an emotional negotiation. That's where your finances can change for the better.
Well, I can't wait to get into that. And I'm glad you mentioned that about law as well. I hadn't realized that about you, that you were in law. And, as a longtime attorney myself, I think so often lawyers and others, frankly, end up following paths either because it's expected or because they started on that path and feel compelled to continue. And that's not living on purpose. There's a whole wide world out there, and find something that you love and that you feel passionately about. So I think that's a great message for all of us. Now, I
Yeah.
love the term financial therapist, and you just referred to a bit. Tell us a little bit about that.
Financial therapy is really this subset, this beautiful subset. I sound biased, but it really is this beautiful subset of the, of the financial planning discipline. And it really focuses on those emotional, cognitive, behavioral dimensions that, influence the way we interact with our money. And
Yeah.
so, when you think about financial literacy, for example, there's really, again, those technical specs. You learn some things about money. You may or may not put those into practice. But when we think about holistic financial wellness, therapy also seeks to integrate along with, coaching to a degree as well. All these things come together, but it really seeks to combine, not only the technical specs, but also this understanding that our financial wellness is deeper than the money itself. It's more
Yeah.
than just those numbers. So we want to get into the emotional parts of this, the relational aspects of this, the psychological components of it. There's a
Yeah.
lot here, and a lot of it has been ignored for a long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Well, I did an exercise not that long ago, a money exercise where you had two people and one was served as a recorder, and they would ask you just different what is money? What is and just framing it different ways. What is rich? And it is remarkable the baggage we all carry around wealth and money and finance, and it affects how we show up. And I'm glad you mentioned mindset. Like, I often say that, negotiating our own mindset is our first and most important negotiation. So I'd love to speak about that mindset issue as well as some of the sort of practical how-to stuff later. So what advice do you have for our listeners on how to negotiate, their mindset around debt? What are some of the factors?
Absolutely. So I agree with you. Mindset is hugely important. And I want to make the distinction because I think it's really important. I am all about positivity and sending good vibes out there, but I am not a toxic positivist. I think there's a fine line between being, rooted in a little bit of woo, but a little bit of reality all at the same time. And I
Yeah.
think that's really key to mindset. And when you are able to put yourself in a mindset to where you are being gentle and kind and compassionate with yourself, and you're able to invite and be receptive to change and learning, I think that's where the mindset shift can take place. We have to make clarity around our money the first non-negotiable to honor our future self, and that is the first mindset shift that has to happen. How would your future self feel about this?
Yeah.
That's where that begins.
Huh. And mental health, I mean, tied to mindset. I mean, I think mental health issues are at an all-time high now. What are some of the more common mental health challenges for those who are facing debt? And what are some things they can do about it, Erica?
Yeah, this is something I see every month. Every month I work with, 1,000 plus clients at Beyond Finance with this specific issue. When we are finding ourselves in a position of debt, I call it the financial condition of debt because for
Yeah.
a lot of people it's temporary, but it feels like we are going through something major. We see a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of confusion, a lot of distrust in ourselves.
Yeah.
And, what brings, people to debt in the first place? We have to think about that. And, there's so much shame wrapped up in just being in the financial condition of debt
Yeah.
that a lot of times people don't consider or don't feel like they deserve to consider the circumstances that brought them to debt. A lot of the
Yeah.
people I work with, they were victims of love scams or
Oh,
investment scams. They were diagnosed with cancer, or their child was diagnosed with cancer, or they lost a job, they lost a partner, whether that was due to, divorce or death. There's a lot of things that can bring people to a critical debt situation. That's not just, the things we think about,
yeah.
like just, this person overspends. And so there's so
Yes.
much there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you talked about the shame because I do think that's a factor. And when we're feeling shame, we tend to not reach out to get the help that we need. And we certainly don't show up with the mindset we need to help get ourselves out of these situations. And I want to circle back when you'd said before about that, speaking of mindset again, you said the first step in terms of a mindset shift is the clarity around your finances. What do you mean by that, just in practical terms for our listeners, if they're kind of scratching their head going, well, what am I supposed to be getting clarity around?
Are you supposed to do here? And that's a great question because, and it's tied back to that financial shame, or both that financial guilt and shame. So the
Yeah.
first step is getting clarity on your emotions around your financial situation. So if you're in a position of debt, you're in that challenge right now. Let's look at first the ways that guilt and shame are showing up and how they might be undermining your financial progress. Financial shame, shows up often is exactly what you said. It's that isolation, it's that silence, it's that avoidance. For some
Yeah.
people, it manifests as overgiving or chronic debt. And the difference between financial shame and financial guilt is, financial guilt is, okay, I made a mistake. You know,
Yeah.
I made a mistake. Like I messed up. I'm going to do something to fix it. I regret that, but it is what it is. Financial shame is I am the mistake. I am a bad person because I am in debt.
Yeah.
And that is really heavy. And so getting some clarity around where that guilt and that shame or other emotions are showing up helps you get that clarity you need to move forward. Financial
Yeah.
shame I consider a form of, this personal gravity that holds us down. And
Mm,
if you're not able to work through the shame, you're not going to be able to eventually propel yourself forward into a space of transformation. And this is where I think financial therapy is great, is that, financial therapy really does work to uncover those emotions and kind of the things we believe about money. But eventually you're going to have to let that go. Eventually
yeah.
you're going to have to heal through that and release that so you can move forward into a place of transformation. And so in my work as, a transformation coach, I do both sides of this. If you can honor your future self, and look at your financial non-negotiables to unlock that financial, transformation that you hope lasts for a long time,
Yeah.
that can make a huge difference.
Yeah. I love that term personal gravity. Oh my gosh, the writer in me loves that. I might borrow that off you. And
Well,
and
I
it,
borrowed it from someone else too, so
yeah, okay, good.
I'll get you the notes on that.
I love that. And it works at both ends. Like we're talking a lot about sort of that shame around getting into debt, but to be vulnerable here, I grew up in a low rental sort of apartment complex in a neighborhood that was considered tough, and I didn't realize how much baggage I had around rich people and all of, sort of greed and all of these negative associations with people who had a lot of money. And I was the first one in our family to ever go to, post-secondary school in our extended family. And I really had an eye opener one day. The first time, always grew up with used cars. It was a big, exciting thing. And the first time I ever got like a fancy new car myself, right? I was driving a Caddy Escalade.
Oh
And
my.
yeah, I was like, woohoo. But I pulled up in front of where my hearing was going to be taking place as an attorney, and I saw all the clients standing out of the front of the facility, and I was embarrassed to show up in that vehicle. So I drove all the way around to the back to come in, and I thought, "Oh my gosh, if I've got that much baggage, then I'm probably not charging what I'm worth. I'm not expanding." So do you find that as well in your practice?
Absolutely. We people have the biggest hangups, and it's so interesting too when you look back on, your childhood. I mean, I think that's a great place to start. There's some research out there that says, people or children by the age of 9 have a pretty solid financial foundation of what their mindset is by the age of 9,
Wow.
which is nuts. So
Yeah.
by the time you know, get all of that, and then you go through
Yeah.
adolescence and adulthood, you've got all this stuff. And so, it's so important to look at those aspects of, what did you see in childhood? Did you grow up poor? Did you wish you had more things, or things weren't available? Or the opposite, did you have so many things? I had a client years ago who was a very wealthy young woman, and she came to me utterly embarrassed because she had no idea how to act with her peers who didn't come from such a privileged
Yeah.
background, and she felt so bad about it. And so we all wear these financial masks, and we don't know when it's safe to take them off. We don't know when it's okay to talk about money, which I think is another issue of
Yeah.
this.
True.
And so it's so important for you to get comfortable with getting uncomfortable, at least by starting with yourself and being able to take a critical look at that. Like, I love what you did. You were embarrassed to pull up in front of,
Yeah.
your clients in front with this beautiful, expensive car. And we could argue that you had worked for it. You came from the
Yeah.
bottom, and you're here, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. But it was still enough for you to recognize in the moment, like, oh, this makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
figuring out why.
And change the mindset around it, right? Then
Mhm. Yeah.
don't beat myself up and continue to beat myself up, but realize that that kind of baggage around money didn't serve me. Now, you use the best terms. We talked about that personal gravity when you said it, I noticed, but you also talk sometimes about loud budgeting.
I
And
do.
I wondered if you could explain for our listeners, what is that and how can they use that?
So I just mentioned how, we don't often talk about money. It's,
Yeah.
money. I found that, over the last 20 years I've been doing this, people don't talk about money often when it's good at all. They'll be sitting around being like, oh, I got a $40,000 Christmas bonus, but so they're not going to be talking about it when money is bad. I'm not going to
Yeah.
have, somebody say, oh yeah, I'm $380,000 worth of,
Yeah.
debt because I got involved in a love scam. I mean, that's a true story, but nobody's sitting around talking about that.
Yeah.
And so there's these kind of two sides to this. And so my idea behind loud budgeting is, getting comfortable with talking about your money around safe people to start. Being like, you know what? No, I'm not going to go out tonight. I would love to go out with all of you, but I am, really funding my Roth
Yeah.
IRA right now. And I know that doesn't sound sexy or fun, but it's really doing something for me. And
Yeah.
so I'm going to sit back and do that while
Yeah.
you guys go do this, or we can do something different. But this is where I'm at with my goals. And it's about being loud and being proud
Yeah.
to talk about those things. And being a cycle breaker, we've got multiple generations here of, from boomers to, Gen
Yeah.
Z who aren't, they're getting better. Gen Z's getting a lot better with this, about having these conversations, but bringing that all together and
Yeah.
into the open.
Yeah. I'm so glad you called that out because I do find, like, even in negotiations generally, issues around money and finances, we've been so conditioned that, you need to hold everything close to your chest and don't go sharing information. And the opposite is true. I think the more we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and real and authentic, the healthier mindset we're going to be able to show up with, the better outcomes that we're going to get as well. So I love that you call that out. And you had mentioned about the different sort of cross-generational. Do you see differences in how people negotiate finances based on their age?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's a huge difference there. When we're looking at, kind of the older generations, there's a protocol, right? You you talked about, like being vulnerable and being more open. The older generations, they play their cards real
Yeah.
close to the chest, right? We don't want to give out too much information. I think about, the old books and old seminars about your BATNA and all of those
Yeah.
things. And you want to, and again, the negotiation rules, I think are, for the most part, kind of evergreen. But there is a point, I think, where we see with millennials, and in particular with Gen Z, where they are a lot more open, particularly Gen Z. They're a lot more open to being a little bit more clear and direct with what they want. And part
Yeah.
of the reason is, Gen Z, they tend to value, a little bit more of that short term, you know,
Yeah.
juice a little bit more, which I
Yeah.
think really does influence their willingness to say, all right, well, if I can't get what I want and I need here, I'm going to go somewhere else. It's
Yeah.
not going to bother me as much as maybe a baby boomer who really does
Yeah.
value, things like loyalty and things
Yeah.
like that. It's a difference in values.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's an interesting perspective because we certainly see that in the practice of law and across all entrepreneurial enterprises. You're hearing that different perspective because causing a little butting up, right? Where one sees it as a lack
Absolutely.
of respect or trust, and the other sees
Yes.
it as a lifestyle choice, and they
Yep.
think we've got it all wrong, right? And
Right.
that's fair.
Right.
Do you see any gender differences, just while we're on the topic about differences in how people deal with debt or finances?
Yeah, just in general, we have found, in some of the studies we've done at Beyond Finance that, women, they're doing their thing, but they are still reporting that they're less confident. And I think that's, I mean, how long has that been going on? We've
Yeah.
been working, whether it's you or me or anybody, kind of adjacent to this industry. We want women to get up and speak and stand up for themselves and negotiate and do those things to ask for more money, to, be more confident. And I just think that continued pattern, while it's improving, I just think it speaks to the level of trust that women have in themselves. And
Yeah.
I speculate that a lot of that comes down to women not being as comfortable with doing that internal negotiation
Yeah.
with themselves to look at what their financial non-negotiables are
Yeah.
and, put those into practice, reframe them and make them work for them, including things like
Yeah.
negotiation.
Yeah. And let's spend a minute on that. And for our listeners, I really want to put a pin in this point because, and again, it's not surprising for the women out there if you're going, yeah, that's me. Don't beat yourself up about it. It's not a surprise. It's not that long ago in human history that women didn't have the right to hold property. Heck, we didn't have the right to vote. So it's not a surprise that we have some ground to cover in terms of feeling that sort of financial confidence. And on the other end, for our listeners as well, whether, male, female, or any of the spaces in between, be aware of differential treatment that maybe you bring to the table as well, because I was stunned with some of the recent studies when Forbes put out about how much less financing goes to women as compared to men, especially if you're talking about sort of for startups and things like that. It was like 2%, some ridiculously low number. And they were applauding that it had gone up by 0.5%, but we were still less than 5% of the financing. So I'm really glad that you called that out as well. And I want our listeners to really put a pin in that as well.
And that's huge. We're making progress. And to your point, it might not be a lot of progress, but progress is still being made, right?
Yeah.
But for women who are looking to, improve their finances, it's looking at the things you believe and looking at your future self. And again, going back to, some of the points I'm making, if it costs you your financial future in any way, it's just going to be too expensive.
Yeah.
Okay. And if that looks like, I'm going to say no to spending that disconnects from my values or from my goals, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop negotiating against myself in this
Yeah.
process. If
Yeah.
you are going through the financial condition of debt, treat your debt repayment as emotional and financial healing, not a punishment. This is something I see
Nice.
all of the time, every week. And, people who are in debt and in a lot of debt, even though they're doing something about it, they put themselves in this debt prison, this
Yeah.
self-imposed prison, because that's what society has, told us, if you're in debt, you're a bad person. Your
Yeah.
credit score is a reflection of your value as a person.
Yeah.
And that's notwithstanding whatever brought them to the financial condition of debt. So often there's many places where we need healing, and it's both emotional and financial. And so being able to reframe these financial non-negotiables, whether you're trying to get financing for your small
Mm.
business or you're trying to negotiate a better contract at work, whatever that looks like, find ways to make your future self proud. Avoidance is expensive. Clarity is free.
Mhm. I love that reframing. And sometimes that's all it takes, right? To kickstart something
Mhm.
is reframing it, looking at it with a different perspective, tell ourselves
Yeah.
a different story around it. Now, you've mentioned non-negotiables a couple of times, financial non-negotiables, which again, I love. Can you give us some concrete examples or like what would be some examples of what are financial non-negotiables?
So, let's say, for example, you are a person who spends money to feel better. There's sometimes people eat their feelings, sometimes
Yeah.
people spend their feelings. Sometimes we're both. I've been both from time to time. Um, so, if you notice that that is a pattern, so much of your financial non-negotiables begin with that really, I want to say loving critical eye,
Yeah.
that internal eye, and just being real with yourself, saying, "Okay, I do this. The reason I can't budget as well as I'd like to, and I was this way. I've had many clients be this way. Why aren't budgeting? Why can't I get a budget that works for me?
Yeah.
It's because I have these great budgeting plans, but every time I go into the store, I spend to soothe some sort of emotion. And for me personally, it was whether I was angry, happy, sad, it didn't matter what emotion it was. If it was a strong emotion, I wanted to spend money. And sometimes we conflate those things into things like self care, right? So sometimes we spend money to self soothe in under the guise of self care. That's sabotage. And
Yeah.
so reframing that into, I'm not going to spend money to self soothe anymore under the guise of self care because I deserve financial comfort, not a financial hangover.
Yeah. So good. Now, let's say we've gotten ourselves into a pickle with what feels like unmanageable debt, and you've given all kinds of sort of valuable insights already. Do you have any more sort of practical steps our listeners could take to start getting themselves out of debt?
Yes. So the first thing I recommend to anybody is to start setting boundaries. And that includes setting boundaries with yourself, but also setting external boundaries. I like to think of boundaries, both internal and external, as guardrails.
Yeah.
Sometimes people like to think of guardrails as failures. Oh, if I have to set up a guardrail for myself, I'm broken. Or if I,
Yeah.
there used to be that kind of trope about going to therapy, in
Yeah.
my generation, I'm an elder millennial, but all of my aunts, uncles, my parents, grandparents, if you go to therapy, there's something wrong with you, you
Yeah.
know. And so sometimes boundaries can also be considered along those lines. And so you might have to rumble with that a little bit. But setting external boundaries and internal boundaries can help you set limits within yourself, with your
Yeah.
family, your partners, or even the institutions you bank with, or your credit card institutions, all financial institutions. There's
Yeah.
there's things here. And when we and social institutions. And so when you are in a position of debt, it's so key to look at the areas where you need to put guardrails for yourself so you don't find yourself in a deeper hole.
Yeah.
And then from there, it's looking at, okay, well, how deep is the hole? And for everybody, the definition of deep is going to be different.
Yeah.
So for
Yeah.
somebody, $10,000 might be a really big hole, where for another person might be 1,500. So
Yeah.
there's different aspects of that. But it really begins by saying, okay, this is what I need to set for myself, and then this is where I need to go to find a plan of action. And so sometimes in that setting of limits and boundaries, you can put together a plan for yourself that says, okay, in 6 months, if I do XYZ in my budget and I can stick to that, I'm going to be good. As long as XYZ doesn't happen. If I need a new water heater or tires in my car, I'm going
Yep.
to have a problem,
All goes to hell.
right?
Yeah.
But, for some people that works. For others, if you're especially, I think about the people I work with who've been the victim of like a scam.
Yeah.
Like love scams, I just can't even tell you
Oh,
how
that's
heart-wrenching those are.
yeah.
And so what happens in those situations is that, you not only have this massive amount of debt and you've most likely lost your life savings, but you've also lost the promise of love and, lasting satisfaction with a partner, and then you're embarrassed because you got scammed and family members might
Yeah.
have already told you that it was a scam.
Yeah.
And so in that situation, you're likely to feel very isolated. And so for those types of situations, that's where I think, coming to, a company like Beyond Finance, for example, that can help you, especially if your debt is extraordinary and you feel that tremendous amount of shame and you're finding yourself completely alone
Yeah.
in the process. So there's different levels. Everybody needs support, but also what
Yeah.
everybody needs to know is you're not alone. This That doesn't discriminate. It just doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. I loved when you talked about the guardrails. I had this instant image of, in the bowling lanes where you have the ones that have the
That's
little
exactly what I
checkers
think
on
of
the
too.
side. I was like, I could use some of those some days. I think that's fabulous. Well,
Yes.
Erica, this has been awesome. I can't believe how quickly our time has gone here. I
No.
normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had? Doesn't have to be around finances, just one of those aha moments that makes you think differently about something or show up differently.
Oh my gosh, hands down, it was the thing that clicked, I don't know, it was mid-30s when I was okay with telling people no.
Yeah.
That the world was not going to end if I said no to another project or teaching another class. And
Yes.
it's like the minute I said no,
Yeah.
oh, my whole life changed.
Yes.
Opportunities came in. I felt taken more seriously. It was the wildest thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Yeah.
beautiful. I love how quickly you had that answer. Some
I
people
know.
stumble over that. You were like, oh my gosh, I know exactly what that
I know.
moment is for me.
Yes.
That's fabulous. And the beauty of learning to say no. And again, for our listeners, I think it's a great insight because we often don't, and women in particular. I mean, that's not, not exclusively a gender-based thing, but women have been conditioned to put themselves last and to play
Yeah.
smaller. And what the minute you start saying no, you're able to prioritize those things that you actually would consider the main things in your life. Because I find a lot of people, if you do that vase exercise, we're so busy doing things for everybody else that there's no room left for the things that if somebody asked us, what are your top three priorities? And you listed them, chances are you're spending way less time on those than things that you're doing for everybody else. So thank you, Erica, for sharing that. And thank you for all the insights. This has been absolutely fabulous. Really appreciate having you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And where can people learn about you? Where do you want us to be directing people to follow up if they want to take
Sure.
advantage of your skill set?
If you want to connect with me directly, check me out on LinkedIn. And if you want to learn more about what I do at Beyond Finance, check out beyondfinance.com.
Okay, beautiful. And we'll make sure to put that in the show notes. So don't panic if you didn't catch it. And do make sure to check out. There are all kinds of resources out there. And when we get past our worry about asking for help, things can really move and shake up and allow you to live into your fullest life. So I have no doubt you got tons of value from this episode. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done that. And be sure to share this episode with people in your life. I was going to say people you think can benefit from this, but no, I'm going to challenge all of you. We need to start having the dialogue, as Dr. Erica was saying, about money. Quit making it a taboo subject. So share this with people in your life and give them the gift of sharing something that's going to help enhance their quality of life as well. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.